I knew when I made my review on the original 1980s Shogun miniseries that I would eventually have to do this. Shogun is a story that means a lot to me. I first picked up the book about 10 years ago and have revisited it many times. I discovered the miniseries not long after and have done the same. I found it all to be incredibly fascinating, all of which described in my previous review. However, I did not think it was a perfect adaptation of the novel, which frankly would have been impossible at the time. What it actually is a marvel of television production. A series that had every obstacle against it and somehow overcame and left a major impact on television. Hell, thanks to Shogun, we had more sushi restaurants open up. But now, in this era of lazy remakes and soulless productions, it was inevitable that Shogun would eventually be remade. The first I read of the remake in production was probably about 6 years ago or so. Of course, no one paid attention or cared at the time, because not many of my generation or younger had ever even heard of Shogun. The only reason that series survived development hell was because of Sonata, who they shot faux scenes with just to keep their fingers locked on the name of the book. The new series is doing good, obnoxiously so. I talked about the first 4 or 5 episodes, but I'm choosing to revise those thoughts now that the series has finished. I'm just gonna throw this out there, right now. Do not expect simplistic praise. Personally, I deplore brain rot reviews. I will be making criticisms where they belong and giving praise where it belongs. I have two main goals of this analysis: looking at the series on its own and how it stands with the book. I've gone into detail of the real historical accuracy and novel in my previous Shogun video, so I'll try to keep it streamlined here. I don't want to do a complete rehash. If anything, you could see this as the continuation of that previous video. Nothing is more important than your opening. You need to grab your audience's attention from the beginning. To me, the opening pages of the book were a prime example of how to do that. It opens during a storm with a lone ship of dying 6 sailors lost, scared, and confused. It's menacing, suspenseful, and intense all in the first few pages. The show opens in the complete opposite manner, as if to say, hey, this is our thing now, this is reimagined. Reimagining is a term used when screenwriters are unable to come up with good ideas on their own, so they take a popular story and put their own twist on it. More often than not, they end up bad, but sometimes they can be pretty cool. I'm not saying that the new show needs to be one-to-one with the book. That's not how you make an adaptation. Even though Clavel was a screenwriter and it kind of already does most of the job for you in that regard, it doesn't really mean that you need to be disrespectful to your source material, though. That's not a good approach. The opening is slow, but it's ghostly and mysterious. It's a great shot, it really is. The fog masks the bad CGI of the ships, whereas the rest of the show will just rely on making it too dark for you to even see. It's just unfortunate that this shot isn't the right tone. This feels more like Pirates of the Caribbean, and the filter is definitely not helping. We get our introduction of the protagonist, John Blackthorne, and let me break this down in simple terms, and let me finish before going crazy in the comments. It is factual that the story was originally from Blackthorne's perspective, because he is a viewing vessel for Western audiences. The book was written in the 70s, where Western audiences didn't know a lot about Japanese history, nor did they really care. They just didn't. I'm sorry. Think of it similarly to Tom Cruise in The Last Samurai, another review I did, where the character existed purely for audiences to experience a not as well known moment in Japanese history. Although that story is also very much fantasy over real history like this one. But unlike Tom Cruise's character, Blackthorne is a more direct parallel of a real person, whereas Cruise is kind of a combination of a bunch of different things that don't really amount to that story it's telling. So yes, Blackthorn is the protagonist in simple terms of how a story works, based on the real-life William Adams, who was the first English pilot to reach Japan. Not only is his story interesting, but it's a no-brainer tool for Western audiences to latch onto. I also don't think people realize that Adams and Tokugawa got pretty close, and he helped feed anti-Catholic thought into Tokugawa, who already did not like them, which furthered his influence in pushing them out and killing hundreds of Christians, something that kind of happens throughout the Tokugawa lineage, really. Now, this version of Shogun is modern, for better or worse, which means that we now have a generation of weebs and others more informed on Japanese history and culture, or at least think they are, so this show felt it should focus its perspective on the Japanese side, because it no longer felt like it needed to be, for a lack of better words, an educational tool, which makes a series of issues later on, as we'll pick away. The ideal way to adapt the novel, in I guess a modern approach, would be to tell the story in a full rounded way, where Mariko, Blackthorn, and Toranaga are all portrayed correctly with the right amount of story spread amongst them that actually benefits the narrative for all viewers. Like the book, which knew appropriately when to switch characters and when to put you in the minds of those characters. I want to say that this version tried, but it's very difficult to. Let's consider the opening crawl. And look, they even took Clavel's name off the title. Probably for the best. The opening crawl gives us information that is completely pointless. Everything said here is what we are already going to learn through the story. This exposition leads nowhere. The opening crawl should be explaining what's going on outside of Japan for those forces that are about to intercept. Let the viewer understand the backdrop. Not everybody watching this is a history buff that knows what's going on in the world in 1600. There's a huge war going on right now, and it's crucial to many of these characters' motivations and goals in Japan. A major theme in the novel is cultural clashes with the Japanese, English, and Portuguese. The latter two are already in a religious war. As for what's going on in Japan with the Taiko, we learn that through the story, because the entirety of the story takes place here. Most of this is supposed to be dialogue that Rodriguez tells Blackthorn. Someone pointed out in the comments that FX actually made a social media video explaining some of the backdrop, instead of putting it into the actual TV show. I can't even wrap my head around that. But I guess the only reason the show didn't sink was from its social media campaigning. Pretty much the only way anything can survive these days. All that said, it's no one's surprise that Blackthorn's crew is completely irrelevant in the series. The captain even shoots himself in the beginning. This isn't a major change, I guess, as he dies later on in the story, but it gives a weird feeling to Blackthorn's motivation. Blackthorn is definitely fueled by ambition, without a doubt. He dreams of riches, sure, and he gets humbled throughout the book. The show makes him seem more heartless and dim-witted, though. For one thing, he talks way too much. Blackthorn was actually someone who had intelligence. Hell, I would even say Adams had a little bit going on in his noggin, and was a rather cunning fighter. But this show thinks it's funnier to say that a sailor doesn't know how to fight, even one who's been in land battles. And they treat him more like a full-on pirate instead of someone who technically was a pirate for the crown. I mean, the Navy. You could look at it in the light of how the Japanese view him, as a bumbling idiot. Which doesn't really make any sense, though, for the more intimate moments we have with him. I've seen many state that they do not care about Blackthorn, or even openly admitted that his actor is not good, but will still say that the show is a masterpiece. That's not how that works. Episode 3 was evidence enough of Cosmo's less than stellar acting.
This is unacceptable. Peering into ladies' private quarters.
The breakdown scene was replaced by silly shouting with dumb jokes, instead of him going crazy and choking the shit out of Ishido. It seems unlikely that Cosmo could have pulled that off anyway. And it's a shame that this show couldn't have tried to make him at least a little bit human. I'm not saying that the show needs to put its entire focus on Blackthorn. I'm just saying you don't have to make him a fucking idiot. We don't need him to be as theatrical as he was in the original series, but definitely not this. I will say, they did a great job on the C look for Blackthorn. It's the only time he actually looks convincing in the entire series. Blackthorn is not a hero, he's not a savior, and he definitely doesn't master anything. He assimilates a bit, sure, and it's a very long and grueling process over the entirety of the novel, where you can really see how his whole character changes to the point to where he's almost completely different in the mindset from how he was in the beginning of the book. But he's still a prisoner. Clavel himself was a POW during World War II under the Japanese, and he described the experience more like a university than a prison. And I can't help but see how some of those experiences translated to Blackthorn in the writing. A proud soldier or warrior of his own land, now a prisoner in a culture completely unknown to him. Also, we're just not going to talk about how comfy the prison looks in the new version. Look like I could stretch my legs out in there. And really, not a lot of good things happen to him here. I mean, he gets laid a couple times, sure, but so? His time here is not fun. It's not really luxurious either, but that does match real history. William Adams did have to stay in Japan for the rest of his life. Tokugawa became close to him and made sure that he was at least comfortable. Tokugawa made Adams a samurai, but only in name. He was never truly accepted as samurai, not in the class, and Clavel knew this, and that's how he approached it when writing the story. The main character this go around is Toranaga, and yes, I'm aware a lot of you want to give that title to Mariko. She is the emotional core of the book, without a doubt, and whatever this is could be seen as such, but Toranaga, no, Sonata, is the damn face of this whole project. They put him on the book covers and all of the marketing. And almost all of the praise I ever see for this is always Sonata first, then Sawai. Mariko's presence in the story should be greater than it actually is. It's sad, but true. This series also lacks confidence in its writing, as do many modern adaptations. There used to be this thing in narratives that was called pacing, where they weren't so scared of losing the audience's attention that they needed to unload everything onto you at once. From heavy exposition to early showings of characters. Toranaga does not even show up in the book for about 100 pages. We all know Sonata plays him. We know he's in here. That doesn't mean he's just gonna suddenly disappear if we don't see him in the first 5 minutes. Let us have build up. Let the audience have some fun and anticipation. Let them settle into the world. Don't just throw everything at them at once. It makes the pacing so erratic and far faster than it should be. These scenes happen much later because that's when they were intended to happen. But we gotta get all of our big faces out in the first 5 minutes nowadays. It really strips away the excitement. Hell, with the allotted time, a good screenwriter would still be able to get Toranaga in at the end of the episode, giving an exciting cliffhanger. Mariko in the new series and even the original series shows up earlier than she was supposed to in the book. It's not without meaning though. She's a secondary translator who is to make sure that Alvido is telling the truth of what Blackthorn says, and that the Portuguese aren't trying to sway things in their own favor. But this highlights what I call the biggest issue of the series, although ironically may have proven fruitful. I like to call this the Jingle Keys strategy. The series is scared that the audience has a low attention span, now more than ever, and has to make sure that they keep jingling those keys to keep your eyes on the screen.
Board!
Here, look. Keys.
Board!
Jingle
Board!
keys.
Board! Board! Board.
I, for one, don't agree with underestimating the audience's intelligence. But hey, lots of writers do. Leaving the ship brings us to another glaring issue. Cinematography. I don't know when the standard fell. I don't. Here we have warped corners, trendy fisheye, shallow focus, probably intentional artificial grain. bad color filters, overexposed shots, shots that are too dark to see, this. And the behind the scenes show that some of these shots actually look good until they overblew it with all this unnecessary nonsense that add absolutely nothing and take more away. It's really irksome that some of these set pieces and compositions are great, but we have to look at them through smeared lenses. This is 2024 for God's sake. Now there are many good uses of fisheye. Hell, there are even some good ones in the show itself. But here it's so damn dependent on it. The most common is to present a character's warped state of mind or in an unfamiliar place, which would work, I suppose, if this was from Blackthorn's perspective, but it's not. So that reasoning is contradictory to the narrative. The reasoning that I heard behind this was to put focus on Toranaga. Well, that just doesn't make any sense at all. I spent a lot of time examining the trailers when they first came out with many of my peers, and we were all less than excited on some of the visual presentations. The whole kaleidoscope effect in particular was quite repugnant and offensive to what could have been a good shot. It's a sad trend that I fear will not age well in the future. But we'll see when we get there, I guess. The CGI also sticks out like a sore thumb. The show looks its best when the environments are practical, and it makes the CGI incredibly jarring. Of course, a lot of fans of the original series will prefer the on-location shooting. I have to defend this series for the fact that it's just not possible to do that anymore. Even the location of Izu is now a resort. A lot changes in 40 years. However, I'm not quite sure why they didn't just film in New Zealand. Maybe the same issues persist, but it's definitely a better location for creating a faux feudal Japan than Vancouver and crappy digital environments. Even Scorsese did a good job recreating 17th century Nagasaki by filming in Taiwan. Of course, that movie in general is miles ahead of this one in terms of cinematography anyway, and I'm not even a huge fan of Scorsese. And I have had comments from Japanese viewers that felt that the environments in this show in particular weren't very faithful to Japan. Many have praised this for having film-like quality. I again ask, when did the standard fall so low? Or has it really been that long since we've had remotely anything good on TV? Another thing to point out is something that didn't bother me personally, but I did get a lot of comments about this, and so it was brought to my attention. Obviously, Blackthorn doesn't have subtitles in real life, and the original series wanted to put the Western audiences in the same amount of knowledge as Blackthorn. So there were many scenes spoken in fluent Japanese without subtitles. That said, only a fool would not be able to feel the emotion from the acting. This series, because of its approach on the Japanese perspective, does use subtitles. I never had issue with subtitles, maybe from many years of watching foreign films, and it's practically second nature to me. That and my understanding of Japanese doesn't really make it an issue for me to keep up. But there are those who aren't accustomed to subtitles, whether they have an injury or disability that makes it difficult for them to read subs, or some people just can't read as fast as the screen, and it puts a damper on the experience for some. And those certain anime fans and fanboys of this series who can only convince themselves that people don't like this show is because they're unable to read. And it's such an ignorant, bitchy excuse. Okay? A lot of people can read the subtitles. That's got nothing to do with some of the problems in the show. Ignorant fanboys will defend anything. There is a dub available, at least on Hulu, which is kind of jarring to me. But watching anything in live action in dub is even more horrible than you could imagine. This show does possess a lot of scenes with just Japanese characters discussing heavy political intrigue that doesn't really make its way to Blackthorn, whose whole purpose is to do that. It's just one of those things, I guess. The book is more sneaky with how everyone is kind of using everyone and how everyone is being manipulative and deceiving others. The show, I guess, didn't have confidence in itself to do that, so they kind of just had to put everything out, and most of the things that don't really need to be as explicit are just kind of shat out at you. Especially with Mariko. Mariko just is completely against her whole eightfold thing that she was talking about. You know, and it's a TV show, so it's kind of hard to show the character's thoughts, but I mean, they did it pretty well in the 80s. The built sets are incredible. I have no complaints, other than I wish that they were shot and lit better. The show again relies heavily on darkness to mask a lot of things, but even goes too far with the quote-unquote realistic dark lighting. This is the show. Light your damn scenes so we can see them on our TVs. Especially these newer TVs with HDR. It's like they're allergic to brightness. My film professor always told me about this concept with lighting, that we should sculpt with light. Light and shadow are significant to your shots. They are the key. The sets are so good in this show that it infuriates me how poorly they are shot. They are underutilized, and your set pieces are crucial for bringing the viewer into the time period. The show puts a lot of effort of its marketing on authenticity. There sure are a lot of historical inaccuracies in here. Let me clarify, yet again, more explicitly. Shogun is not real history. It parallels real history. It is a novel. It is fiction. Clavel does not want you to think that this is a real story. That would be silly to think that this is a real story. Even the opening for Taipan, he says the same thing. It is fiction. Now, many historians have praised it for historical accuracy when it comes to the overall thought and cultural attitudes. And that does not mean that these events took place. Many of them parallel real events, but they themselves are not real. Blackthorn parallels Adams. Mariko parallels Hosokawa Gracia. These two have never met. Most of the novel works on a blank period of Adams' life, where most historians discuss the before and after. His arrival in Japan is pretty cut and dry, whereas Blackthorn's is more dramatized. Clavel was a brilliant writer, but he also knew what audiences wanted, and so he was forced to add things like sex and romance. It was the 70s after all. What I'm saying is the story is not real, and there's a lot of romantic elements thrown into it, but a lot of the environment and culture is regarded as pretty accurate. Most of his inaccuracies are minute details. For instance, the Jesuits wear orange robes. They did do this during their early times in Japan, so that the Japanese would know that they were holy men, and because the Japanese found the color black on clothing to be rather unappealing. This practice was revoked by Francisco Cabral, and so by the time Adams arrived, they would actually be in more traditional attire. Shogun 2024 got that bit right, but at the same time, removed much of the vibrancy from everyone else's clothing. Women, in particular, of high class wore bright, vibrant, trendy colors to show off their class. Mariko wears many beautiful colors in her robes in the book, but the show has her wearing mostly dull colors to show her cloudy and depressed character. That is artistic expression over authenticity. And artistic expression is fine. Just don't lie to your audience. Even Sanada looks like he has reservations on this. Being that this series is now from the Japanese perspective, it has a lot of added filler. Filler are scenes that are meant to eat up time, and traditionally don't actually do anything for the main narrative. These are scenes that aren't included in the book. Early in episode 1, Omi searching the ship is an example of filler. I think it's one of the best shot sequences in the show. Now, the sequence is cool, but it doesn't add anything to the main story. Meaning, you could cut this scene out completely and not lose a single thing. And the book didn't have this scene, and it went on just fine with having Blackthorn waking up in Japan and being like, oh hell. Simultaneously, we get Blackthorn scenes done at an incredibly fast pace that have little to no weight on them. They don't even let the audience sink in what's going on. Blackthorn doesn't meet Sebastião, giving him the immediate terror that the Catholics have some influence here, and the decapitation of the Christian has absolutely no meaning to anyone. The act in the original was in defiance to Omi, who called Christianity stupid, so the Christian did not bow to him and lost his head. This was a lesson for Blackthorn to learn how much manners mattered here. In this one, we understand he's a Christian, but leaves us wondering what Omi gets out of this. He was manic in the original, cutting the guy into pieces and laughing. I really wanted this show to do Omi justice. He actually turns out to be a character, and unfortunately, Both shows dropped the ball on that. As before mentioned, this show chose to do certain scenes earlier, and we also have additional filler to beef them up more than what's really necessary, as is with Fujiko, although the scene is pretty good, it just doesn't make any sense realistically. The first issue with this is with Toranaga. I've already expressed my discomfort with how this show portrays him as more sympathetic, and some people didn't like my use of that word, but it's true. Meaning that they took away his more cruel or hardcore aspects, such as putting Hiramatsu's grandson to death. Here he simply says, "You failed yourself as samurai, you die." In the book, he not only puts the man and his infant to death, revokes not only his samurai class, but sees him less as a human being and makes him crawl to his death on his hands and knees without the ability to walk. But hey, he gets to plead with his wife for a bit. You know, it's not realistic in the slightest because when an order is given, that order is carried. You don't get to argue it. And then Toranaga says this after. So, yeah, that's my problem with Toranaga. That, and they also removed his humor, making him almost completely stoic in this. I mean, he makes a couple smirks, sure. The funny thing about that is that this is not the first time that's happened with Sanada. There is another character who was far more unique and fascinating, although not necessarily a good person, but completely different from his film counterpart from book to screen, which was another portrayal carried by Sanada, and that was The Ring. Another video for another day. There are other little details that are really important for a character that this show just doesn't really get, like the diving scene. I was excited that this show was doing that scene, only to find out they did it wrong. Toranaga was supposed to attempt the dive after watching it once, and he fails. And he fails again, and again, until he finally gets it right. That's how you write a believable leader, one that convinces the audience that he's worth following, even when he's deceiving everyone here. In the show, they make Blackthorn do it with heavy focus on the observational learner aspect, which Tokugawa was, but it doesn't really make logical sense in this case. And then this is where they start to force a connection between these two, as they cut out previous scenes that actually show them growing a bit of a bond. The boat sequence, of course, kind of solidified that, but even before then, there was a moment where they share a dance and song together. And Toranaga rewards Blackthorn with a robe, which in its own right is his own form of assimilating Blackthorn and kind of tricking him into this. So those scenes are important, they're not just silly nonsense. On the bright side, Yabu is quite great in this series. He may actually be the highlight, outside Hiramatsu, who is just flat out perfect in every aspect. Hiramatsu, mwah, perfect, amazing. Couldn't be any better except for killing him off for absolutely no reason at all. It was stupid. With Yabu, when Frankie Sakai played him in the original, it was pretty controversial because he was a comedian. Yabu was a more vile, sadistic character, but I think many forget he has a dark sense of humor, even in the book, which Frankie did a surprisingly good job at adding that dark comedic element to his on-screen portrayal. And I feel Asano did a damn good job doing the same thing. Some people have complained that he's a little too quirky, and I can kinda get that, but I really feel like he did a great job capturing the character. Although it is weird that they made him into a cuck now. I guess they wanted to steer away from the more disturbing aspect of the original scene where he bedded a young boy and Kiku at the same time. Pederasty was very common at the time. It was. Japan in general was pretty open with a lot of things, and definitely were enough to make a Catholic blush when they arrived. The show seems to want to not acknowledge those aspects and kind of steer away from it. And I guess I can kind of get it because almost everything is scared of anything remotely controversial these days. But history has its dark sides, and I feel it's somewhat immature to treat history like a fantasy by ignoring the bad and glorifying the good, which is something that this show does so much. Another thing this show fumbled was Rodriguez, and really the Portuguese in general. You may not know this if you've only seen the remake, but Rodriguez is actually a really, really good character, a significant one, if you will. His dynamic with Blackthorn is one of the most interesting and memorable character interactions of the story. Their friendship is done so well, Both of these parties from opposing sides of the war put into a forced friendship due to their circumstances in Japan. Furthermore, Rodriguez deals with these heavy moral dilemmas about killing Blackthorn, a person that he genuinely likes and does not think should die. They relate so well and they get on like real bros. Their friendship is supposed to be sneaky but ends up warm. He's supposed to be someone who's investing, deep, complex. Even in the novel, when he first meets Blackthorn, he's described as being warm and friendly.
Well, send your tits up. My God, you are a pilot. And English, too. Fuck me.
In this, he's a joke. It yet again is the polar opposite of what it's supposed to be. Is this the modern idea of charisma, charm? It seems to be devoid of all of that. And if that was their intention, well then it's just plain rude to a good character. Even his swearing, or the swearing in general in the story, had more class to it, but here, the writing is just juvenile. But so is the general writing of this show. It feels like it was written by a 15-year-old who just finished playing Ghost of Tsushima and thinks that that's real history. At least we get the boat race. It looks awful. Not only has Rodriguez been reduced to a joke, he just disappears. There is so much more of his story that is just completely erased, which is a fine way to describe the entirety of the Portuguese roles in this show. Would you believe me that that is another major theme that this story neglects? Their overall theme of power, which coincides with religion. The Portuguese play a major role in this story. In this version, they pop up every once in a while to remind you that they exist, and they don't really give the audience anything to work with. All of these characters are pushed back to being nothing, and occasionally a joke. And of course, you're probably thinking, well, this is a Japanese story, who cares? Well, you should fucking care, because their influence was a big issue. Just look at Kiyama, one of the leading forces who is also a Christian. That was Tokugawa and Nobunaga's fear, which would eventually lead to the whole expunging of Christianity, killing anyone who practiced it or tried to teach it during Japan's return to an isolated state merely 20 or 30 years after this story. The Portuguese were the first Europeans to reach Japan. They were the reason Japan had guns, they inflicted the cuisine, and their religious influence was intimidating. They are pivotal in the Sengoku era. The Battle of Nagashiro was handled mostly with their guns. Trade and religion went hand in hand here. For the most part, the Jesuits were a guise for infiltration. Behind them, Japanese people were being traded and sold off as sex slaves, which, when this was discovered by the Taiko, made a major crack in their relationship with Japan. So now, here's an English guy showing up, and they're rightfully scared now that their enemy is on this land that was originally a gold mine, with very strong trust issues. They're wanting to build a temple and reestablish that trust, and to further their influence was a big deal, especially for Toranaga, who could take advantage of this. And they barely give us anything to work on, and it ends on a joke. Alvido's role was supposed to be more important. With Blackthorn's arrival and new information making its way to Toranaga, whatever the Portuguese told him could now be countered and obviously complicates whatever seeds they had planted. Toranaga now also wanted to know about the Portuguese and Spanish colonizations and their spoils of the New World. Alvido was the second in command for the Japanese missionaries, but he also spent most of his life in Japan and knew the land better than his own birthplace. He knew the language fluently, which was enough to garner some connection. Alvido was more dedicated to his cause and subsequently made him more menacing than we see here, who just looks like he's gonna cry every time he's on frame. An entire character, one that I very much enjoy, a Japanese character, and plotline was cut out completely that involves a Japanese Catholic who renounces his religion due to Alvido demanding him to be whipped for sleeping with a prostitute. The man was a proud samurai and would not allow such shame to his honor, thus renouncing his faith, and becomes an ally to Blackthorn, one that can actually speak to him in a mutual language, Portuguese, although he meets an unfortunate fate, and it's actually very sad. But hell, the Japanese character whose involvement with Christianity and poses the question of why Japanese weren't allowed to be missionaries and starts to question how the Portuguese actually view the Japanese isn't important for this Japanese story. Alvido and Blackthorn also have great scenes together that are just gone or bad in this. Is it time for Mariko yet? Mariko is my favorite character of the story. She's such a well-written, phenomenal character, and I'm really sad that fans of this version won't really get to experience that. As I said before, Japan was misogynistic and very patriarchal. Ever heard of the story of Izanagi and Izanami? As if not to say still today. And the female characters are written in a realistic, believable manner of the time period, and this makes them more compelling because we can see how they can manipulate and control the situation from their lower positions. Even though they are still seen under men, they hold a lot more control over them. Ochiba, this series did phenomenally well, far better than Mariko in every aspect. There is a lot of filler added to the character, maybe to build on the later rebellion against Tokugawa that is irrelevant to this series because the book doesn't go that far, but I digress. I have no issue with Ochiba or her additional scenes in the series because they're good and she is a great character. The actress is great, the character is well presented, and actually is expanded in a proper manner that benefits the story in some fashion. On the other end, Mariko, they watered down greatly. Many have praised Sawai for their performance of Mariko. Cool, I guess. She, however, willfully chose to not do any research of the character and put all of her faith into the screenwriters instead of taking time to learn the source material. I discussed this with my acting buddies, and they seem to agree that you should have at least the basic context of the character when playing them. She started by studying Hosokawa Gracia, and that was your first mistake. They are parallels, but they are not the same person, and they shouldn't be. Mariko in this version is incredibly westernized and is very much modernized in her presentation. The entire family dynamic was changed in the series to equate what you would see in an average American program about a trash family. Bontoro is a character I hate the most in the original. He's a vile, pathetic, awful human being, but a good warrior who at least has that respect. Here, he's an unsettled buffoon. His character is now the equivalent of a drunken dad who just lost a bet on a sporting event. Mariko hates Buntoro, and has from the moment she met him, something she explicitly says in the book. Anna Sawai apparently, didn't read the book, so she thinks that maybe she did, maybe she didn't, showing her very little understanding of the character. He's always treated her like a trophy wife, but never knew who she was. And when she turned to Christianity, it changed everything. He began to see her in cahoots with the barbarians. Mariko is strong. Strong because she is so intelligent, so incredibly smart, that she puts herself above this male-dominated world. She puts on the face that they want to see. Match their manners, play the role with a smile, while underneath is someone more tactful, real, and human, someone who is truly more liberal in their mind to the customs, and she is torn between Western religion and Japanese ways, Christianity and samurai, someone who is powerful and romantic, someone who can pull the strings of everyone except Toranaga himself. And in this in this version, she even tries to say that that's what she is, but fails to portray that. She's snarky, brattish, and worst of all, dull. They are trying so hard to force modernized thought into this historical fiction, which just goes against the intelligence of the character. This is a historical fiction. You need to bring these characters of that time to life. That's what makes the character so compelling. They took away Mariko's incredible monologue and replaced it with a prolonged temper tantrum that is not complimentary to the character. Her outburst completely throws away the strength and resilience of this character. The fact that they almost made this character likable in the episode prior is even more insulting to drag them so much further down. This is a character who rivaled others in intelligence, and you treat them like a rebellious teenager who makes snarky remarks at the dinner table. It is entirely disheartening how one of the most underappreciated characters in literature was turned into another generic TV character that you would see on any other damn show. And are we just not going to talk about how Karate Kid 2 did the tea ceremony better than this? That's actually an embarrassing statement to make. At least the show handled Osaka better, which is what most people remember since all of her important scenes have been cut or reduced to rubble. They did tone down the relationship with Blackthorn and Mariko, which I think is for the better. It always felt like it was forced for an audience agenda, as if Clavel had to throw some romance in there to help sell the book. It's pretty wild too. I mean, they have sex a lot. Even during the Osaka Castle hostage situation, they're having quickies whenever they can. For what it's worth, a lot of modern complaints for the book have been about how smutty it is, which I find hypocritical given this generation. It plays on how liberal Japan or the East in general was compared to the conservative West. Some reason people read this as the book glorifying the white character as some large appendage Casanova, which is furthest from the truth. The book, in truth, actually makes fun of Blackthorn for how bad he is in bed, stating that him and Westerners are rather boring and one-minded. And I don't think that that's incredibly unbelievable for the time period. Anyway, I do appreciate that this show downplayed their relationship, but I wish that they could have just nixed it completely, because now whenever they are together, it's gross and weird and I feel yucky for looking at it. Because there's no romance to it. In the original, even while it was unnecessary, it was still romantic. Other than that, this is handled pretty well. We do somewhat get her Osaka speech, which is the second best moment of her character, and the attempted seppuku, which doesn't look nearly as compelling as it did in the original. But now, instead of Yabu, it's Blackthorn who's supposed to assist. Okay. It's also inside and incredibly dark. If they shot it better, this could actually be a pretty incredible, tense scene. Better composition would add intensity, tension, suspense, all of the elements that could add to the scene. You know, there sure is a lot of modern makeup on her. And yet again, her death is not as gory as it should be. Especially with this version's exaggerated explosion. And she's just fully intact after that. Also, wouldn't it make more sense for the flashback to be when Blackthorn watches his master get blown up by a cannon? Wouldn't that cross the story better? It's also bizarre that Blackthorn doesn't lose any of his senses here. In the book, he is temporarily deafened, and in the show, he is blinded. But in the remake, it's neither. They just said, fuck it, we're on the last episode, we don't have time for that. It's actually hysterical how much story is left in the last episode. Maybe if the last couple episodes didn't have so much filler, not there yet. I will say, they did Fujiko very well in this series. The actress is great and really brings nice extra layers to the character. The whole bit in the first episode isn't that great, but it does end up in the right place. However, her pleading to Mariko makes absolutely zero sense. What power does she hold on your situation? In the book, she talks directly to Toranaga, and it's one of the few times he gets really pissed off because he can't just kill her, but she won't shut up about wanting to kill herself. The pheasant scene doesn't really make a lot of sense. Blackthorn by this point should know a decent amount of Japanese, at least in the actual source material, where Mariko's purpose here is to be tutoring him, but instead he's just here to twiddle his thumbs because who cares about that? Who cares that Toranaga demanded he learn Japanese before his return so they could communicate better? Who cares that Yabu was going to burn the village and kill every single person, man, woman, and child, if Blackthorn did not learn the language? Who cares if he attempted to kill himself to get the decree revoked, which earns him a new level of admiration and confusion from Yabu and Omi? Let's just cut that out, and an incredibly important part of the story for more Council of Regents scenes that ultimately end up being redundant. We'll let Blackthorn try and kill himself later so Toranaga can look cooler during the Are You Really Alive scene, because intelligent writing isn't important in this. So, Blackthorn knows what the word die means. He said it, and he obviously understands it when Fujiko repeats it back to him. It's that simple. He understands what that word means. This also illustrates the lack of range that Cosmo has in the original, and he simply just says, "Don't touch the bird, or they'll have to answer to him." Here he explicitly says the word die, a word he obviously understands. Someone pointed out that it still makes sense because he doesn't understand the power that he has. Oh yeah, sure, okay. How does that make any fucking sense? Do you think he has not been paying attention to the place he's been at for months? where death happens so casually. Death is the only punishment or exact lines said to him while he's imprisoned. Unless he was a complete idiot, he should understand death means death. There's no way around that. The gardener's death breaks him so much that it's enough to make him cry. Although in this version, who can tell the difference, because Cosmo looks like he'll cry if the wind blows on him too hard. It's like we're becoming allergic to good writing. After this, there's supposed to be a heartwarming moment with Fujiko and Blackthorn, important for both characters, showing them grow closer, and Fujiko becoming less interested in killing herself. And also, after the extremely exaggerated Chernobyl earthquake, Fujiko is barely even hurt, but with that, she gets more scenes now, compared to her leg being busted up like it's supposed to. But now she gets more scenes, like this one with Hiramatsu, which I actually really like. It's a nice scene. And of course, I am so happy that they included the scene of Fujiko pulling the guns out on Omi. It's badass, but that scene also doesn't make any sense. Toranaga is supposed to directly give the guns to Blackthorn in front of everyone, so that they know that they're his, and it is his gift from Toranaga. In this one, Mariko just half-assedly gives it to him, and then Omi wants to take it away under Yabu's orders, and it doesn't make any sense. That is a gift from Toranaga. The reason that he tried to take him away in the book was because Blackthorn was going to go to Yabu's house, and it wasn't allowed in his house. That is far more realistic. Another character that I thought they were improving, but ultimately obliterated, was Naga. Naga, unfortunately, had almost nothing to do in the original miniseries, although he too was a character. This version plays really hard on trying to make him a wide-eyed, I want to make my daddy proud type of character, which takes away from his more badass moments. My favorite being when the assassin invades the castle at night, Naga chops his head off and then spits in his face, asking if anyone recognizes them, before throwing their head to a guard, and then proceeds to cut that guard in half. Toranaga afterward punishes all of those on guard at the time, in a manner that you can probably assume. But we don't see that in this version, because he's a cool guy, you know, he's more sympathetic. But hey, he gets to kill the assassin this time, hey, that's pretty cool. Yeah, let's let the guy who doesn't fight because other people can do it for him fight, because Sanada probably wanted to do it. And I get it, Sanada is a very skilled swordsman, but you're sacrificing the character here for your own desire to be cool on screen. I pointed this out before with the assassin scene, that they replaced the ninja, if you will, with a maid under disguise. I can understand why they didn't want to do the ninja, because it's become overplayed, especially with Western audiences, and it is a stereotype, even though the irony being that this is the time period where they were the most active and most used. Although they did choose to use ninja-esque at the finale, I don't know. In the book, Blackthorn agrees to teach Yabu's armies Western strategy, particularly how to use their guns better. The show thought cannons would make more sense because Japan had already had guns since 1548, and cannons needed more work on. Japan has had cannons since the 1200s. But the show puts Josen's death on Naga, pretending that it's some significant thing that signals a war that had already been going on since Toranaga left the castle, if not before that. That is just a stupid exposition line for audiences who might not understand what the hell is going on. In the book, Omi, Yabu, and Naga were all in on this, and even asked Blackthorn to be a witness, which Mariko calmly explained to him. It was all a pretty chill scene, actually. But hey, cannon make big boom! Oh yeah, they killed Naga, by the way. Absolutely no reason for other than shock factor, I suppose. The showrunner said that they didn't know how to adapt the end of the book. Well, thank you for at least being honest about that. So they gave us an episode and a half of filler with lots of focus on Izu. We're still in Izu. Toranaga's brother plays a bigger role this time, and I actually like this. I like the dinner scene until this happened. And that's when I realized, oh, okay, they're wasting our time. Got it, thanks. But this adds extra pressure to Toranaga. Toranaga already has a lot on his plate. That doesn't mean we need filler, okay? We get the point. Naga dies because they didn't know how to close the episode and needed shock factor to keep the viewer interested. Because his death means absolutely nothing to the narrative. Absolutely nothing. It does nothing. If you think that Toranaga would actually care, you're crazy. Toranaga would kill his own son to make a point. He kills infants to make a point. Not to mention, he already has a baby on the way, and in his mind, he can always make another. They're expendable, replaceable. Yeah. Thanks for killing a character for absolutely no reason. But I mean, I guess they didn't have much else left to do in the story, so whatever, sure. Oh, and they did the same exact thing to close the next episode as well. Alright guys, we killed a character off that didn't need to die to close that episode off. That'll really get people to want to watch the next one. How do we close this episode? I got it. Let's kill another character that doesn't die. Genius. That is just genius screenwriting right there. And it just had to be Hiramatsu. One of the characters that they did so good in this adaptation. Oh yeah, and during this episode, Blackthorn beats up Peterzoon. Yeah, I want fans of the book to let that sink in. This show, and it's so eloquent writing, has had Blackthorn do nothing but say, "Can I see my ship, please? My ship? Can I see my ship? I need to see my ship, please. Can I see my ship? Hey, it's cool you got a war going on, but can I see my ship?" And then finally, he gets to see his crew again. He tries to, and then as soon as he sees his crew, he tries the 180 and then ends up getting in a fist fight with Peterzoon. It's so disrespectful. In the book, he was disgusted by the poor hygiene of his crew, but they were still his crew, and he promised to bring them home. He cared about his crew. He did. He's not a good person, but he at least had that for him. And you know what? Maybe he did just want to use them to get home. But either way, this doesn't make any sense. And Peterzoon's snap to sanity and death at the result of the Erasmus, gone. Yeah, all of Peterzoon's scenes are gone and it's just completely cut. Another glaring issue with the series is the action. Now, Shogun is not an action story. People are upset that they didn't show the Battle of Sekigahara. It's not the point of the story. It's not an action story. There are action scenes in it, sure. And it's described in a realistic, brutal, almost horrifying manner. Blackthorn is horrified when he watches the maids who helped him run the castle get shot and drowned. And all the other soldiers don't care because they're just maids. Their lives are irrelevant. There's nothing fun or exciting about it. It's cold and heartless, and the action is bad. I was worried about the show's marketing on the action. It seemed like they were going to put a lot more focus on it, and thankfully they didn't. And the actual scenes are limited. But the ones that exist aren't good. And it's not the actor's fault. I know that they trained a lot for this, and they put so much work into it. But they should have hired someone who knows how to shoot action scenes, because everything here is predictable. The actors look as though they're waiting for their marks, and there's no intensity. I was initially deceived that this was going to be a great change, because now the arrows were coming out of the trees. That was a great change. It makes it more intense. Originally, they were on rooftops, but the trees are actually scary. You can't see your enemy. And now we got Blackthorn and Mariko using Naginata. It's not nearly as cool as Mariko shoving a flare in the samurai's face like in the book. There's a lore point that the samurai aren't supposed to kill Mariko, so them being bad on purpose makes sense. I don't actually recall the show bringing that point back up. I also doubt that they thought that hard about it. At least they got the Naginata right. That was the weapon that Onimusha, female warriors, and female samurai would use. Later on in episode 9, during the Osaka escape, they also finally show us this fight that was cut in the original. Which was fine until they started jingling those keys in front of us again. I do feel obligated to point out more positives before closing on this. So I scrolled through the episodes. The opening flashback in episode 2 is a really good addition. It makes the opening of episode 1 irrelevant, but adds a nice visual explanation that helps the audience. They also included the scene of Yabu saving Blackthorn, and it's pretty good. Having most of the action clouded like Blackthorn's perspective was actually surprisingly smart. It's unfortunate though that there's a scene prior to this that spoils Yabu's entire thing, which should make episode 9 predictable to anybody watching this. In episode 3, well, they show Buntoro running off. That's good. Episode 4 all around is pretty good. The bat scene was a little more conservative, but the dialogue is pretty much right. All of the Ochiba scenes. I noticed many have been struggling with the ending, and I don't believe that they handled it the best way. If people are asking, was this Toranaga's plan, or what is Toranaga's plan, then they didn't explain it right. Yet again, the showrunners, when explaining this, used the words, I think, on something that should be explicit. We know, because the story tells us. In a monologue, Toranaga directly tells us everything was his plan. Everyone was a pawn to him. He burned the Erasmus, and he'll do it again. He'll do it again. He wanted to be Shogun. He wanted it bad, and he got it, no matter the cost. The show tries to convey that by having him talk with Yabu, a character he feels he can relate to as they are both incredibly ambitious and used others for their goals, which takes away the entire Yabu seppuku scene. The ending is not very good in the show, but the scene on the boat with Fujiko and Blackthorn is pretty sweet, although many have complained that the whole letting Mariko into the sea thing is a pretty westernized idea and a westernized concept. I can kind of agree with that as well. I realize that Tokugawa was a badass, and a lot of people see him as a hero, but I think with historical figures, all of them, we should acknowledge that some of the things they did can be seen as not so heroic. And I think that this story, the book, show, whatever, you can make an argument that Toranaga was the villain all along. Not only did he use everyone for his own ambition, but he also held Japan back from an open world and certain modernizations. Granted that the Edo was a time of peace, under tyranny, it still unified the country. So there's pros and cons. But again, this is all history, and the concept of good and bad is blurred, especially when we put in our own modern, groomed moral compasses into it. So, that's Shogun 2024. A show that, while being pretty mediocre, has gained major attention thanks to the superhero fatigue felt by audiences now. The desire for a new Game of Thrones. I sincerely hate that comparison that people make, and because it's Japanese, with Japanese characters. For me, it's just such a shame how half-assed this series is. It goes without saying that it's not a good adaptation. It's not. But I've said this many times before. A bad adaptation does not mean a bad project. Many books have been translated poorly that turned out to be pretty good on their own. And I'm sure a lot will feel this way about Shogun. But frankly, even without the book, I can't see it being much more than mediocre. I still think the show is worth watching, and I don't hate it. These are critiques, which seems to be a bit of a lost art now. Trust me, I have yet to talk about something I hate on this channel. Even as recording this, they have just announced that there is a second and third season in the works. They've already covered the entire book, so that means it's just filler. And not to mention, Tokugawa dies in about 13 years, and a lot of that's just going to be political reforms. There's really not a lot left to do. I mean, in that time, Tokugawa ushers in the Edo period and unifies Japan, which makes the samurai grow bored and more bureaucratic. Japan will eventually turn to an isolated state, kicking out foreigners outside their limited trade with the Dutch, and Christianity will be purged, but a lot of this happens after Tokugawa dies. Besides, the remake barely did anything with the Portuguese, so who cares? Plus, Silence already did that. The only thing I could really fathom would be Yodo or Ochiba's and the heirs' rebellion against Tokugawa. But again, the book is done. The story is done. It's over. Now, at this point, they just want more money. I can understand that this was an ambitious project, and it's scary from a studio's perspective to put a lot of money into it, especially because you don't know how it's going to do, how it's going to fare, which is why it spent so much time in development hell as well. And I'm sure COVID also played a role in setting things back a bit. But it did well, and now the studio's kicking themselves because they could have done so much more with it, but they were scared. It was such an ambitious project that they kind of rushed through it half-assed, which means that this show could have been so much better than it ended up being. And if you think that this is a masterpiece, this is barely even scratching the surface of the potential that we could have seen in this series.